Hello, my name is Jason Anderson. I'm a teacher trainer, writer and educational consultant, and this talk is a short summary for TESOL Academic of an article I wrote for ELT Journal, Volume 70, Issue 3, published in July 2016. The article is entitled Initial Teacher Training Courses and Non-Native Speaker Teachers. I'd like to thank Hugh Jarvis and TESOL Academic for this opportunity to share the findings of my research through the TESOL Academic platform. The article reports on a largely quantitative study I did in 2015 comparing and contrasting the self-report responses of 41 native and 38 non-native speaker teachers who had participated in either the Cambridge Celta or the Trinity Cert TESOL teacher preparation courses. It compares and contrasts things like the backgrounds, prior teaching experience, reasons for participation, future teaching contexts, and participants' perceptions of which course components were most useful and how well they felt their needs were met. I'm going to divide the talk up into 6 sections. After talking a little bit about the history of these initial teacher training courses, and then identifying my reasons for conducting this research, I will look at the prior literature and research on non-native speaker participants on teacher preparation programs worldwide. I will then outline the research methodology, describe the findings, and discuss their implications, broadly following a similar order to the article itself. So, initial teacher training courses such as the Cambridge Celta and the Trinity Cert TESOL were originally designed to equip prospective native speaker teachers of English as a foreign or second language with no prior teaching experience with the necessary skills to enable them to teach their mother tongue to adult language learners. The Cambridge Celta evolved from an international house qualification called the IH certificate, originally offered in the 1960s, and the Trinity Cert TESOL first appeared in the 1980s as an alternative to the Celta. And the two offer largely similar syllabi. Both courses involve approximately 120 to 130 hours of input and a minimum of 6 hours of observed and assessed teaching practice. Now, because it was assumed that the participants on such courses would be native speakers and that they would have little, if any, prior knowledge of their learner's first language or languages, or indeed culture, such courses traditionally, and still do to a large extent, focused on helping native speakers of English gain the necessary classroom skills to enable them to teach their mother tongue to adult language learners through the monolingual communicative methodology that has largely been promoted as the default teaching approach in Anglophone countries since the 1970s. Of course, since then a lot has happened. Not only has the default superiority of monolingual English-only language teaching been questioned and often found wanting, but more critical writers on language pedagogy such as Robert Phillipson, Adrian Holiday and Suresh Kanagaraja have rejected the assumption that a pedagogy developed and perceived to work effectively in Anglophone countries is likely to be the best pedagogy in other contexts. So this leads me on to the second part of my talk, why I conducted this research. As a teacher trainer, I'm lucky enough to have worked extensively worldwide in both pre-service and in-service teacher education. I've spent a lot of time working with primary and secondary teachers in low-income, middle-income and high-income countries around the world, both for national ministries of education and for support organisations such as UNICEF, VSO, British Council. Anybody who's done this is likely to agree with me that there are massive differences between the learning context, the needs of the learners, as well as the resources, strengths and support needs of their teachers around the world. I'm also lucky enough to have worked extensively, albeit intermittently, on both the Cambridge Celta and the Trinity Cert TESOL courses as a trainer since about 2003. I've often noticed over the years a growing number of non-native speaker participants on these courses. And I noticed that in contrast to the majority of native speaker participants who do not have prior teaching experience generally, most non-native speaker participants are experienced English language teachers, many of whom also have prior qualifications relevant to English language teaching and are often capable, knowledgeable, effective teachers for whom significant amounts of the syllabus on such initial teacher training courses is of little, if any, use. Thus, I wanted to understand more about why they were taking such courses, what they were getting out of them, and I also wanted to confirm my suspicion that there were these significant differences in the backgrounds of the majority, not all, of non-native speaker participants when compared with the majority, again not all, of native speaker participants on teacher education programs. So, to move on to the third part of this introduction, when I looked into the prior literature on non-native speaker teachers on teacher preparation programs, I found lots of interesting and useful research, but it was research on teachers on rather different types of courses. The majority of it had been conducted in North America and focuses more on non-native speakers, on longer, more academic courses such as MAT SOLs. However, none has ever been conducted on non-native speakers on the shorter, more practically oriented initial training courses such as the Cambridge Celta and the Trinity Cert TESOL. Furthermore, I noticed that the research that has been conducted on such academic courses focuses largely on what Musu and Yurda in 2008 called the additional or different training needs of these participants on the course itself. Research by authors such as Dylan Liu, Kami Stein, Yurda, Samimi and Brooke Griffler did confirm my strong suspicion that non-native speaker participants tend to have prior teaching experience and prior relevant education, that they often return to their home countries to teach upon completion of their courses. It also confirmed that they generally have higher language awareness and lower language proficiency and generally express a strong interest in developing their proficiency in cultural knowledge during their preparation program. This research also indicated that such teachers may often suffer from a sense of identity inferiority in relation to native speaker teachers. But importantly, they do not necessarily see themselves as less successful than native speaker teachers. So to move on to the fourth part of my talk, or rather of this introduction, it seemed that research into non-native speaker teachers on initial teacher training courses was undoubtedly needed. Firstly, to either confirm or deny that they exhibited similar profiles and needs to non-native speaker teachers on the more extensive academic programs as found in the North American research. And also importantly, for me as a teacher trainer, to understand their reasons for taking these courses which are designed for pre-service trainee teachers when the majority of them are experienced practitioners. I felt that through conducting this research I would be better able to understand all the participants on the courses where I was training and thereby provide more effectively for all their needs. I identified two research questions as follows. First of all, what differences exist between non-native speaker and native speaker course participants on initial training courses with regard to A, their prior teaching experience and qualifications, B, their reasons for taking initial teacher training courses, and C, what aspects of the course they found most useful, and finally D, their likely future teaching locations and age group of learners. And the second question I was interested in was the question of to what extent did native speakers and non-native speaker course participants perceive that their needs on the course were provided for, and what needs of non-native speakers were not provided for. So, for the majority of this initial exploratory research, I felt that a quantitative study would suffice, although I also wanted to provide some opportunity for respondents to provide qualitative feedback, especially with regard to the needs that were not provided for. So I opted to collect data using an online questionnaire approaching respondents via the course providing institutions, 14 for the Cambridge Celta and 14 for the Trinity Cert TESOL. I included further education, higher education and even private course providers from 15 countries worldwide, including centres based in both Anglophone and centres based in non-Anglophone countries. There were just 9 largely multiple choice items on the first page of the questionnaire. The last item asked respondents how well the course provided for their needs. Any respondent who did not indicate the highest level of satisfaction was then taken to a second page where they were invited to provide qualitative feedback to the open question, what needs did it not provide for? all responses were anonymous, and at no time did I encourage them to name the course providers. Now, as recent discussion in the literature and the English language teaching community has highlighted, any research that attempts to separate native speakers and non-native speakers of English needs to address the validity of this dichotomy carefully. Some authors, going right back to the mid-80s, like Thomas Pakerday in 1985, have argued that this dichotomy is not valid and that we should not observe it. Others, such as Peter Medjish, have argued that the differences are important and understanding them can help teacher educators to provide more effective support. A large number of researchers, going right back to Ben Rampton in 1990, have argued that there is more likely to be a continuum between native speakers and non-native speakers, rather than a black and white cut-off point. So one of my questionnaire items required respondents to self-identify as either native speakers, non-native speakers, or other, with an opportunity to comment on this if they required, in line with recommendations by authors such as Jun Liu, Peter Medjish and Davies. Of 82 respondents, only 3 selected the category other, which I thought was interesting. And while interesting, their responses were discounted for this data set because I had implicitly accepted the distinction in my research hypothesis. Responses of the remaining 79 respondents, 38 non-native speakers and 41 native speakers, were then analysed and reported upon. 48 of the respondents had completed the Cambridge Celta, and 30 of them had completed the Trinity Cert. So let's move on to the 5th and the 6th part of this talk and look at the findings of my research. Well, firstly, as expected, very large differences were found with regard to prior qualifications and teaching experience between native speaker and non-native speaker respondents. 47% of non-native speakers indicated that they did have prior teaching qualifications, prior relevant qualifications, shall we say, compared to only 10% of native speakers. More significantly, 76% of non-native speakers had over a year's teaching experience compared to only 32% of native speakers. Significant differences were also found in respondents' reasons for taking initial training courses. While native speakers tended to prioritise the opportunity to travel, the opportunity to try out English language teaching, and simply to become an English language teacher as a new profession, non-native speakers were much more interested in learning about the methodology promoted on these courses, and closely related to this for reasons of professional development. And there was also significant difference in that non-native speakers were more likely to perceive that doing the course would improve their job prospects. Interestingly, very few respondents chose to improve my English as a reason for doing the course, indicating a significant difference from non-native speakers on the more academic North American programs. Now, when it came to the course components themselves, the differences were smaller, and this is interesting. But we can see one very large difference, that non-native speakers didn't really find the language awareness aspect of the course of much use. This stands to reason, and it's known from the literature, that given that they are experienced teachers and expert learners of English, and they probably know much of this explicit language knowledge very well, non-native speakers showed much stronger interest, for example, in the learners themselves, which I also thought was very interesting. Unsurprisingly, the research also identified that while 66% of non-native speakers expected to teach English in their home countries, only 20% of native speakers did. However, if we interpret this difference as a difference between Anglophone and non-Anglophone countries, we can actually see that the large majority of respondents, native speaker and non-native speaker, were expecting to teach in non-Anglophone contexts. Possibly the most surprising response for me, or finding for me, was that the non-native speakers were more likely to expect to teach adult learners than younger learners after the course. I had expected the opposite. It may be that many of these non-native speakers are taking this course specifically in order to be able to teach adults, whereas native speakers were more likely to select younger learners. Now, with regard to the final item on the research, which asked participants how well their needs were provided for, the research found slightly higher levels of dissatisfaction among non-native speaker teachers, although it has to be said that these figures indicate very high levels of satisfaction overall, with Cert TESOL and Celta courses, both of them, something for which they should be commended, given the intensity and the fact that most participants are privately funding their participation on these courses. So let's move on to the discussion and interpretation of the findings, which I'm going to cover a few kind of key points about, and there's a few more which are in the paper itself. Now, given that, as I expected, the majority of non-native speakers on these courses have extensive prior teaching experience, we can surely anticipate that some, if not most, of the instruction directed at basic skills such as giving instructions or staging lessons is likely to be of less use for the non-native speaker teachers, something that is reflected in my personal experience as a trainer, and also that given the well-documented high levels of language awareness among non-native speaker teachers, the significant amounts of time devoted to language awareness on these courses is likely to be covering content that many non-native speakers know very well. As one respondent to my research commented, "As I have been teaching for more than a decade, I was expecting it would be a little more advanced," referring specifically to the theoretical content. In contrast, despite the heavy focus on language awareness, native speakers were much more likely to feel that they still had huge gaps in language awareness, as one respondent put it. Now, importantly, as I note in the paper, pre-service training and in-service teacher development are very different things, and the non-native speakers, being experienced teachers in the main, are likely to benefit far more from focusing on verbalising and developing their personal practical knowledge, as Paulo Colombek has called it. As such, they're likely to benefit from a more discursive and less directive approach to feedback on the teaching practice element of the course, something that I've seen some teacher trainers do very well and others not so well. Treating these experienced teachers often as if they were blank slates rather than who they are. I think this is an issue that needs to be explored and could possibly be addressed in teacher training development support provided by the validators of these qualifications, Trinity College London and Cambridge English Language Assessment. Another interesting area for discussion is the importance attributed among many non-native speakers to the methodology on the course. As I've already mentioned, it cannot be presumed that the methodology on such courses is appropriate for all contexts, and indeed, one respondent with 25 years prior teaching experience found that when she attempted to implement what she had learnt on her course, her students began to complain. I also discuss in the paper the important issue in current literature of monolingual versus bilingual or multilingual, possibly even translingual approaches to language teaching. While almost all non-native speaker teachers are likely to be expert or capable bilingual teachers, given that these courses are preparing teachers to work both with groups of learners who share their first language and groups of learners who don't. I also discuss in the paper the important issue in current literature of monolingual versus bilingual or multilingual approaches to language teaching. While almost all non-native speaker teachers are likely to be expert bilingual teachers, given that these courses are preparing teachers to work both with groups of learners who share their first language and groups of learners who don't, both the Cambridge Celta and the Trinity Cert TESOL syllabi, and as a result the courses themselves, devote very little attention to this important issue, something that I think needs to be addressed carefully, especially when participants are all non-native speakers, as is happening with increasing frequency nowadays on many Celta and Cert TESOL courses. Indeed, next week I travel to Egypt to work on Celta courses where all the participants, as far as I know, will be experienced non-native speaker teachers who share their L1 Egyptian Arabic with their learners. Now, the discussion section of the paper does address a few other issues, such as going into more detail into differences between my findings and those of the research conducted into non-native speaker teachers on longer, more academic courses in North America. I've hopefully discussed some of the most important ones, at least for me personally as a teacher educator. So I've covered all the 6 areas that I wanted to in this talk. Just to recap, these are the history of initial teacher training courses, my reasons for conducting this research, the prior literature and research on non-native speaker participants on teacher preparation programs worldwide, my research methodology, my findings and their implications. In conclusion, I would like to make 3 points. Firstly, that the vast majority of respondents were satisfied with their initial teacher training course, with 93% of native speakers and 95% of non-native speakers indicating that their needs were provided for either very well or well. This point is important to emphasise, I think. Secondly, bearing in mind the very significant differences found, it is very likely, given that these courses are based on a model designed for native speakers with no prior teaching experience, that they can surely be improved so that they can also benefit experienced non-native speaker teachers more effectively. And thirdly, the final point I'd like to make is that more research is needed to understand these differences and to provide for these divergent needs. In the paper I suggest 7 potential areas for research. Most importantly, I think we need to understand how these courses fit into the continuing professional development and career paths of non-native speaker teachers who choose to take them. I also think it's important that we identify in greater detail which areas of the course are useful, which areas are more challenging, and what kind of assistance could be provided both for non-native speakers and native speakers on the courses. Despite the fact that well over 10,000 people take these courses every year, there is remarkably little published research on them. And also, I call for more research to help us to understand the relationships between participants on these courses, including ways in which native speakers and non-native speakers can work together effectively, help each other, and create a richer and more mutually beneficial learning community for all participants involved. My name is Jason Anderson, and that was a summary of my paper entitled Initial Teacher Training Courses and Non-Native Speaker Teachers for the 2016 issue of ELT Journal, provided through the TESOL Academic platform. Many thanks to Hugh Jarvis and TESOL Academic for allowing me to share this, and thank you for watching.